I think. Yeah, I think that's as much as I can make it. Okay. I'll introduce you very quickly in French, and then I'll hand it over to you. Okay. Just a second. Bienvenue tout le monde. Comme vous voyez sur l'écran, c'est notre invité Chirag SHAH qui est là. Et puis, il nous parle de... Un instant, il faut que je regarde l'autre version là. L'ingénierie des requêtes à la science, le progrès de l'ingénierie des requêtes vers la science des requêtes. Et puis, il est professeur à l'école d'information à l'Université de Washington. Il mène des recherches à l'intersection que vous connaissez déjà. I'm not going to waste more time. The people have seen the English version as well, so I give you the driving seat. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for inviting me here today. I hope you can hear me well.
For a second, it's very
feel
quiet.
free to interrupt me. Traveling at the moment. Are you okay?
Yeah, it's not loud enough. Let's see. Say again something.
Can you hear me?
Better. It's better.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Maybe all right. So again, feel free to interrupt me if there's any issue. I'm on a hotel Wi-Fi traveling right now, so just you know, things could go wrong, but hopefully we'll manage. As you can see on this slide, so I'm at University of Washington in Seattle, and I've run a couple of things there. One is the Info Seeking Lab, and the other is this Center on Responsible AI. And overall, I care about intelligent systems, but I also care about making them, you know, free of biases, making them fair. I am excited about what a lot of, I also see that there is often this kind of a blind rush to deploy some of these things without considering the consequences or effects. And so in this talk, I will present some work that I've been doing, first starting with more of a theoretical stuff and then putting this in practice at different places, and in an effort to turn some of these, you know, when I say engineering, I don't mean something bad, but essentially a lot of ad hoc things that happen in using these tools to something perhaps more systematic. My presentation is intentionally brief. I hope I can finish in brief, and not just because I have to leave, but I also want to have more time for discussion. I understand that we have, you know, several students and thank you for sharing your questions, concerns before. I would love to hear from you and see how you perceive these things and what questions you have. So hopefully we'll have enough time for discussion. As you know, LLMs have been very effectively used in all kinds of things. In fact, what I'm talking about here are LLMs being used in different kind of research problems seen in the last couple of years that have used LLMs for all kinds of data analysis, machine learning, annotations. They've been used in different fields, from healthcare to finance to education to defense and whatnot. So that's been kind of great to see. You know, suddenly there is this kind of a gold rush that has been happening. But we also know that there are a lot of issues with these tools. And these are just a very small sampling of that. We understand that these tools can hallucinate. They can make stuff up that don't exist. They can incorrectly link things that shouldn't be linked. They are biased. They can be, biased. Now, all of these things keep changing, obviously. As every new model that is put out, there are claims about it being better in terms of these issues than before. But these problems exist. And it's not just that these problems exist and maybe, with time they're getting better, but these problems are often unknown to the people using it, including researchers, including people who are seasoned researchers, scientists. They often don't um, recognize these issues. And so there have been a lot of cases where not just the regular users have been fooled by this, but professionals, right? Where there was just last night I was reminding some of my colleagues here, talking about that first case happened, or one of the first cases happened where a lawyer in New York used ChatGPT to construct a case summary and ended up citing cases that didn't exist. So the cases that are hallucinated by ChatGPT. But that was one of the first cases, but there have been tons of other cases. So even people who are lawyers, teachers, scientists, with PhDs, they have been fooled by this. So the question is why? What's going on? And so I'll put this quote by Andrej Karpathy. An LLM is 100% dreaming and has hallucination problem. A search engine is 0% dreaming and has a creativity problem. And so what we're trying to say here, Andrej is trying to say here is, look, LLM is amazing because it has creativity. It has, but because of that, there's also a hallucination problem. And so many cases, including when we're working on research problems, that often we do require that amount of creativity, but it cannot come at the expense of accuracy or correctness. And so hallucination is a bad thing. And so what we want to do is we want to have that creativity, because we don't want to just result to like that 0% dreaming thing, but can we do something about hallucination? And hallucination, again, it's a contended term. There are colleagues here, even at the University of Washington, who don't like that term because it has a, it has an association with mental health. It also indicates that this is something, hallucination is often considered, it's a human characteristic, and we shouldn't be giving that to a machine and so on. But also hallucination often doesn't address the real problem. And the real problem is that of reliability and trustworthiness. So when we look at hallucination, we are really talking about, okay, well, this tool is generating something. Can we trust it? How reliable it is, how repeatable it is, how accurate it is, and so on. And in general, what my interest has been is a lot of these things. And again, I don't mean to offend anyone by saying that engineering, and so I have a very narrow view here of engineering where essentially you're focused on solving problem, but less about how it's done, and less concerned about creating kind of a generalizable knowledge that can be used for other purposes beyond just solving that problem. So that's what I mean by engineering. But one of the purposes here I've been exploring is how do we turn this ad hocness into something systematic, something that we value in science, where essentially it's generalizable, it's repeatable, it's verifiable, and so on. So to that end, I will first describe a method that is inspired by qualitative coding. And so I would start by first explaining what it is to those who are not familiar. And if you're interested, this is coming out in Communications of the ACM. I've shared the preprint version of it. I believe it's coming out in a couple months, maybe in May. But it means that it would be in print, and it means that in the online version, it should be available sooner than that. So here's what typically happens with prompt engineering. There is a certain amount of ad hocness. And so here I'm going to take a look at a very specific application for prompt engineering. So here, the objective here is to do some processing with this data, right? So let's say you're doing labeling of the data, annotation of the data, analysis of the data, right? But essentially, this is something that typically human, like a data scientist, will be involved in working on that. But now we are putting LLM to it. And with that data, you have some prompts, some instructions to that LLM. And LLM, has a response. So the response could be some, analysis of this data, some annotations associated, and so on. And then based on what you get, you then revise the prompt. I mean, you can't revise the data. Data is data, right? But you can revise the instructions if you find that the response is unacceptable or not good enough, and then you kind of keep going through this until you have the response or the annotations done correctly or good enough, and now you're ready to apply to whatever application you have, right? So this is kind of the main loop here that is often done. And I'm simplifying. Obviously, there's a lot more to this. People talk about, zero-shot approach to few-shot approach to chain of thought and all that kind of stuff that happens. But, generally speaking, there is some kind of revision involved in the instructions until you start getting the processing done the right way. The problem with this is there's often there's a tendency to bend the truth, if you will, to get it what you want. So I often compare this to like torturing LLM, right? If you torture somebody, sorry for using this analogy, but I'm going to continue with that. If you torture somebody long enough, good enough, then they will start admitting whatever you want them to admit. And so the problem with that approach is it's not clear when you start getting what you want. Is that because that's the truth, or is because you torture them enough, right? And so that's a fundamental issue with this approach, that at some point when you're able to solve that problem and you're able to get things, it's not clear, is it because that's what the underlying truth is, that finally you got to the right prompt to get the LLM out of it, or is because you really bend the truth so much, because we know LLM will admit to anything to please you. And there have been plenty of cases where we've seen where even when LLM could be very confident, even when it's very wrong.
Can I ask you a question? You said questions during the talk. I have a question now.
Yes.
Yes, it's like a prisoner being tortured and forced to reply whether they have any reply or not. Why aren't you identifying that as being the problem? That's not part of LLM. That's part of the training procedure.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think that's what we are trying to do here, that assuming that you're not going to be able to change the behavior that LLM exhibits, right? So you're not going to change LLM itself. What can you change here, right? Because it is your approach that is causing LLM to admit to whatever you want it to admit. And so that's exactly the point here, that we're not going to change this, but we're going to change this. The question is, how do you do that? Right? And so that's where we're taking inspiration from qualitative coding. And this is a quick overview of what we typically do. So for a similar case, so this kind of thing where I describe where you have some data, you want it to be labeled. What you typically do in qualitative coding is there's a training phase and there's a testing phase. So in the training phase, first off, you need to have at least two people. And a big reason for that is to overcome subjectivity what that one person would have. But there are other purposes for this too, and I'll walk you through that. But you have two people, you got your training data, and you got your instructions. This is equivalent of your prompt to the LLM. This initial set of instructions can come from anywhere. It could come from literature. It could come from prior knowledge. It could come from any kind of reasonable, it's sort of like creating your first prompt, right? Whatever makes sense, reasonable is a starting point. So those instructions in the training data are given to these two different people in parallel. Both of them label the data or provide their annotation. And then those annotations or labels are compared to compute intercoder reliability. And this is computed using, Cohen's kappa or some other, similar, method, which looks at the amount of agreement as well as disagreement. And there is usually a range. So if it's between, I don't know, 0.35 and 0.6, then it's a moderate. If it's 0.6 to 0.8, it's high and so on. So, you look at the ICR and then say if it's not good enough, then you go back. This dotted arrow kind of indicates and you revise this instruction. So this is sort of like what you're doing prompt revision, right? But at this point, one big difference is these two people, they would come together and they will discuss their disagreements, right? So they got low ICR because there was a disagreement. There was more disagreement than there was agreement. And so they discuss with one another why those disagreements happen. And as they're discussing, they're not simply resolving the conflict, but they are resolving misunderstanding. So let's say there are two possibilities, like this is binary labeling, and one label A and other label B. They discuss, what should be the correct label? Okay, well, correct label actually should be B. In that case, this first person misunderstood something about this. And so then say, well, in that case, we need to revise the instructions to make sure that a case like this in the future does get label B and not A. So they work together to not only resolve the conflict, but also collectively revise instructions. Then they repeat this process. But at this point, now they get different training data. So they don't work with the same training data. So they get a different sample. Once again, they do this. They go through calculating ICR. If it's good enough, you're done. If it's not, you repeat this. And so, again, this is not a new technique. This has been around. Qualitative research has been doing this for a long, long time. There are variations of this, but essentially, this is what you do. And once you achieve enough ICR, now your training phase is complete. And then the outcome is this, the instruction or the code book. Now, for the testing, that revised instructions or code book is now used for doing the testing. And at that point, what you do is you have the testing data and you can split it and then give half the data to one person and other half to the other person. They both use this revised instruction set, and they're doing their labeling. At this point, they both are working on separate sets of data so that, because now we don't need to look for overlap. We don't need to, because we believe that at this point, they both have achieved the right understanding, similar understanding, and that these instructions are now correct instructions, right? And so now we are not torturing these people to admit anything they want, we want, but instead we have made sure that they are given the right instructions that they will be able to carry out even on some new data. And we believe that that data, when they're labeled, they would have, provided the right kind of labels that they both will agree. Now, again, there is still subjectivity. I mean, this is why this is qualitative coding. There is, but we have reduced the subjectivity significantly through this process. So this is typical, qualitative coding. And the question is, well, how do we use this for prompt engineering, things? So this is our typical prompt engineering kind of a loop. So there are two parts of it. As we saw in this, the first part, and so there's a training part where you revise this instructions. Now, the problem with this, one of the issues is if you don't know the ground truth, if you don't have the ground truth, you're essentially relying on these two people agreeing, right? So ultimately, honestly, this is not about getting the truth. This is about getting collective understanding. And this is a philosophical question, is the collective understanding equivalent to truth or not? But I won't go into that. But that's what we're trying to do. So here, that's what we're doing. Now, in case of LLM, sure, we can go for the collective truth, but the first thing to know is, can we know if this is the right criteria to use for evaluating that truth or evaluating that agreement. Okay? So this is similar to, like, imagine you're kind of not torturing, but interrogating LLM, right? So before you walk into the room, you need to first figure out how would you be able to tell if the LLM is telling the truth. And so the first part of this, so this is the pipeline, and you work backward. So the first part of this qualitative coding is to figure out what is the right criteria through which you should evaluate the LLM response. So before you look at the response, and this is very important, because once you start seeing the response, you already kind of start bending the truth to fit that, and you're already thinking about how to revise the prompt and so on. So before you get to the prompt, first figure out through which criteria you will judge this response. Now that criteria, again, can come from literature, some prior work, or some hypothesis you have. So this criteria is your first, going back to the qualitative thing, is your first code book or instruction set. Then you take some data and have these two people apply those criteria to that training data, apply the and come up with the labels and measure the ICR and so on, right? So you do this loop in which you are focusing on making sure that you have the right criteria to judge the response when you actually see the response, right? So you go through this. Then when you have enough, good enough ICR, then you freeze those criteria, right? So criteria could be, for instance, in this case, we're going to use relevance and novelty and I don't know, diversity or something like that. And here's how relevance is defined, and here's how diversity is defined, and so on. So that's sort of that's what comes out of it. So you pin down exact definitions of those criteria. Now you're ready to start evaluating. So what now happens is, yeah, you have some initial prompt, you run the data through LLM, some response comes out. You apply those criteria to see based on those criteria, right? So you're not just making stuff up. You're very clearly and as objectively as possible, you're applying those criteria to the response. And then you work on this loop. So again, multiple people are involved, at least two people, similar qualitative process. But now they're revising this prompt based on meeting those criteria. And their individual understanding at first, and then collective understanding. So this prompt revision happens, not just getting the quote unquote right output, but fulfilling the criteria that were objectively defined beforehand. So you're kind of separating those two processes. So that's one of the points. And the other point is you have multiple people involved in independently constructing this, verifying it collectively, and then revising it. So one of the benefits of this, not only it reduces subjectivity quite a bit, but in the process, you kind of develop this. I compared this to, like, how we open source code, right? That if you have some, empirical stuff, you have your code, so that allows somebody else to run that code on different data and verify things or reproduce things. So that's one of the outcomes of this, that all of these things are heavily documented. And that allows somebody else to take that and repeat it or verify it, right? As opposed to if you're simply focusing on revising the prompt just to meet what you're looking for, it's very hard to put that subjectivity into the process that somebody else can also, go through. I see there's a question, so I'll take that. Virginia?
Go ahead. Turn on your microphone. Jimmy, turn on your microphone.
I did. Thank you. One problem that I have had frequently is when there is a contested area, which most areas are, and your first question is, tell me, for example, whether being bilingual improves cognitive processing. It will say that it does, and it will not give a full range of the data that I know are out there. So I could, in general, now say, have a prompt that says, tell me about this and tell me the things that are in favor of it and the things that go against it, and to the best of your ability, come up with a conclusion. But unless I do that all the time, I can't trust its answer, and I have to know more than it does. And I want it to help me when I don't know as much as when I'm not an expert. So as an expert, I can evaluate what it says and tell it, no, you missed all this other stuff. And I can create a more adequate general prompt, but I'm in areas that I don't know, it's really hard to figure out whether what it's given me is lacking. And so that then makes me think, well, why am I using it to begin with?
Good question. So my short answer, and you may not like it, so this does not address that problem. So this method does not address that problem, right? I mean, so there are tons of issues because these people that we are looking at, these are not experts. They don't have to be experts. So this is a kind of a good thing, but also it's a bad thing to address the kind of problem that you are mentioning, which is you are an expert and you know what you know, and you are looking to like what I don't know kind of a thing. But here, these two people, they just need to be reasonable people, right? So they're like typically, researchers, but they don't have to be expert in this particular case. So what and that's why I was saying that they're not necessarily judging if this is the truth. They are looking at if you and I have subjectively different understanding of the problem, can we come to a reasonable understanding so that if forget about LLM, right? I mean, in the qualitative coding, there's no LLM here, but given new kind of data, you and I both will label them same way, more or less, right? So that's what we are trying to aim. So we're trying to aim for a collective understanding that is as objectively defined as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the truth, and especially the truth as an expert we'd recognize. So it is very possible that these two people agree on something that is not truth, right? That some expert may come in and say, what are you guys doing? This is all wrong, right? So we don't have that guarantee. All the guarantee we have is these two people have objectively similar understanding of something. And because of that, we believe that this must be true. But again, it depends on your application. So I wouldn't use this for everything, right? I mean, I would use it where so typically where we use crowd workers, for instance, right? Where it's a relatively low cognition task that any reasonable person can label it, say, yes, there is a cat in this picture. I don't have to be expert on cats to recognize that there is a cat. And that's all we are trying to do. So I think those kind of tasks, that's where this is suitable, but unfortunately not for the thing that you're describing.
So
and also,
in other words, it increases reliability.
It increases, exactly. It increases reliability. And I'm leaving out the cases where you should not be using LLM at all. Like, doesn't matter how you verify these things or not, right? So yeah, there are definitely cases where you should not be using it. Thank you for asking.
Yes, Chirag, if you don't mind if I add something. Virginia is a psycholinguist, but the area of specialty, and it's actually psychologists who develop this rather than engineers, is in the area of peer consensus and reliability. In fact, even in psychometrics, inter-rater reliability is a social psychological thing. It's not about whether they're telling the truth or not, whether it's right or not, but how to get something that they agree on.
Yeah.
Since you're applying this to science, I'm curious to know how you think this will produce science in the use of LLMs.
So I'm not claiming that this produces science. I'm claiming that this gives us a more scientific method. And the way I'm claiming that is because it produces, as I was saying here, this process produces something that is documentable, that is repeatable, that's reproducible, that's generalizable, verifiable, right? So because in the end, it's not just the outcome, but the main kind of a thing that comes out of it is the process. And so in the typical prompt engineering thing, there's a lot of ad hoc decisions are made that are not documented. And even if they were, they're not repeatable. So because here we are involving multiple people, because we are separating the way to evaluate the data, the labeling or the response, and actually doing the labeling, all of that allows us to have documentation that is less and less subjective. And that can be carried. So it's sort of like open sourcing your code or your system, that somebody can take it and build on top of it, or somebody can take it, run it more or less the same way you ran it. And that's the benefit. So I'm not saying that it produces science, but I'm claiming that it produces more of a scientific method for doing this. But so I haven't even gotten to the application, like, does it actually lead to something good? That's sort of outside of the scope for this. This is mostly focusing on coming up with a systematic process.
So to follow up briefly on what Stephen said, psychologists distinguish between reliability and validity. So this is a method for improving reliability. It leaves validity untouched.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. So let's take a look at a couple of case studies. And this work also is, well, it's not published yet, but it's accepted. So hopefully it will be out soon in the transactions of the web. It may be printed in a few months, but it should be out on the web relatively quickly. So this is work that was done at Microsoft. And there we had this problem of understanding user intent, which is a known problem in a lot of other areas, where a user comes to the system, a search system, and issues a query or asks a question. And we want to know, what do they mean by that, right? And so, what do we mean by what they mean by that is, are they looking for factual information? Are they looking for opinions? Are they looking to learn? Are they looking to execute something, those kind of things. So some of those intentions. And so we can do that by manually looking at those, things that come in. Like if somebody asks you a question and, can you tell me what they mean by that? So you can do human annotation, which is going to be reliable or valid most times, but it's expensive and it's not scalable. Machine learning models, which is typically how it's done now, they need large training data, and depending on the domain, they also need a lot of retraining. Or we can use LLMs. The nice thing about LLM is it's a pre-trained model. And so with the right instructions, the prompt, you don't have to, like typical machine learning model, you don't have to train it or retrain it, and it just works out of the box, but it's also a black box. And it can create a feedback loop, right? So as I said, often LLMs, they would admit to whatever you ask them to admit, or we expect them to admit, but it's, how do you know it's true? So what we came up with is say, well, let's involve humans, so human in the loop, but let's use the machines, LLMs. So LLMs are good at generation. Humans should do curation, right? LLMs can do the annotations and humans do the validation. So this is kind of, Virginia was asking earlier about, yeah, it's, validation. Just by using LLMs, you can really, maybe you don't have that, but, the right expert, the right human coming in can provide the validation. And so I'm going to describe how this process works. And this is using that method I was describing before. So here's what we did. So the objective here was to generate a taxonomy of user intent, right? I should have probably mentioned this. So that's the application. So we are trying to understand user intent, but more importantly, we're trying to understand what are the possibilities of user intent, like what are the categories? Yeah, and so we're trying to generate a set of categories or taxonomy. So the taxonomy could be, like essentially hierarchical, but it could also be flat. So these are the phases for this. So phase one, we have some training data. And in our case, these were conversations with Microsoft's Copilot. So people coming to Copilot and asking questions and getting, conversation. And feeding that, so this is our data, and then we have some initial prompt that we give to LLM to have it come up with intent taxonomy, right? Now, before we do that, we already have determined what are the right criteria for judging if it's the right taxonomy. So if you remember that the two loops, the first loop, you start from the back where we, so we've already done this at that point. So we already know how to evaluate a good taxonomy, and that comes from literature in our case. So using that and using the initial taxonomy that the LLM generates, we go through that second loop that's on the left side where we do the validation and revision. So at that point, multiple humans are involved, like two people are involved, and they're using the LLM to generate the taxonomy, then using the criteria that were predetermined to see if that taxonomy meets the requirements and so on, and kind of revising it. And so going through that, and that generates finally the final taxonomy. And then that's applied in the testing phase. In the testing phase also, even though this is generated through all that process, we still don't entirely trust it. So we still want to test. And so we use LLM. And then this is important that we use and that's used to the ends on new data. Compute, so this is a testing of, and then we compute the intercoder reliability between human annotator and this new LLM to see if the same instructions, right? So the instructions are given to the humans, the same instructions to this LLM. So what is their intercoder reliability? And that's another place where we do the validation or for reliability.
Chirag, there's been a little bit of signal problem, but tell me if you're hearing me clearly. Virginia pointed out that the area that this applies to is reliability and validity. And that's less social psychology in the end. It's more psychometrics. What you want to do is you have multiple measures of something, and you want to validate the measure as being a measure of something else. That's called face validity. Right? It's not enough. You can't say that when I've shown that everybody agrees about that this is X and not Y, and therefore it's X. All you've done is shown agreement, inter-rater agreement. How do you plug into validation? You're using the word reliability and validity as if they were interchangeable. They're not.
Yeah, no, I agree. So here, this is reliability that doesn't provide validity itself. And so, you know, it kind of depends. This wasn't needed, I can imagine it, but is that, again, in our case, we didn't have to do that because this was a very simple case of applying a label, just like you would have, crowd workers in Mechanical Turk or some other place where you just kind of apply. But I can see, so we didn't do that or didn't have to do that for this particular application. But where this human has some domain knowledge, who has some idea of what is the right or what should be the right or what doesn't look right, rather, to kind of provide that expert intervention. But we didn't do that here. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to start going through some of the results quickly. So again, the way we were kind of maybe compensating this, I don't know if this answers your previous question, or we were trying to compensate the validity part of it is by having more and more reliability among more and more people and more models, right? So this wasn't simply like one LLM and one person agreed or disagreed or something, but multiple people and their level of agreement, and multiple models and their level of agreement, and then models and the human agreement, and so on. So we did a lot of those things. So we use GPT-4, Mistral, Armis, and each of them, first, this is the taxonomy generation part. So we had them, the phase 1 and 2 that is aimed to just generate the right labels or those set of labels that, and so same set of instructions that we fine tune given to different LLMs and ask them to come up with the categories or taxonomy. And what we found is they had more or less agreement on what those categories should be. So for instance, information retrieval or finding is one of the categories, problem solving, learning, content creation. So these are the intents that are recognized in the user requests coming to Copilot. And these are, over like, and each of these things we ran 10 times, with different sets of data. So GPT-4 ran 10 times on different slides here. Out of those 10 times, how many times information retrieval was one of the intents that it identified, and so on. So you can see the top 5 are more or less common across. There are some things that, I don't know, ask for advice or opinion that came up 3 times for GPT-4 out of 10 runs, 2 times Mistral, and so on. But, these are more or less agreed upon. So what it tells us is this was not something that only one model kind of, so this prompt that we came up with was not just specific to one kind of LLM. And that's one of the problems that happens, that, you kind of get into prompt engineering and that prompt is so fine-tuned to that LLM that it may not work for something else. So this is another thing to show that what we came up with is actually independent, more or less, of an LLM. And then applying this, so this is the taxonomy generation thing, and then applying that in the testing phase. And as I say, we measure ICR there, and the ICR between human and human and a model, and so on. So there also, and Cohen's kappa here, anything that's 0.6 or greater is considered high agreement. So in most cases, we do get pretty high agreement, which again tells us that, now again, is this the truth? No, I'm not claiming that, right? But I'm claiming that this is now as objectively agreeable as possible between humans, between models, between human and model. And so that's what we've been able to do. And all of these things is well documented, that can be repeatable, that is repeatable and easily generalizable than if it was typical prompt engineering. So we also apply this to, so now we'll talk about the application. So this was just, and then we said, can we apply this to an application? And one of the application we had was to say, well, people come to Bing and they can do search or they can initiate a chat. But, behind all of that, they have some intent, right? And so we wanted to see, what are the differences in intents when people do keyword-based search versus people do question answering, right? So we ran through all that pipeline, and then for testing or for training, and this is kind of different. So now the training data had 500 queries, search queries, and 500 chat requests. So we haven't combine heterogeneous kind of data and went through that whole process of generating taxonomies and verifying taxonomy and so on. Okay. And then ultimately came up with this, that these are the 5 intents, and then we actually specifically asked, let's restrict ourselves to like 3 to 5 or 7 intents and so on. And then we applied it to a different set of data, about 2,000 search queries and about 15,000 chat requests by the same user. So what we wanted to see is the same person giving running a query or initiating a search, a chat session what are they trying to do? Like, what are their intents? And when they have certain intent, do they go to search? Do they go to chat, right? So, I mean, one of the underlying questions we were trying to address is, for instance, you're trying to book your vacation. Do you do search? Do you do AI-based chat and so on? And so this is what we found. And the results are not that impressive or interesting. This was just to kind of show that we can do an application from all of that work. That when it comes to finding information, people are using search and chat almost equally. Create that intent, and this may not be surprising that people are using like chat, because with chat you can have AI-based generation, whether it's writing a report or creating an image, right? This was interesting for learn intent. So when people have intention of learning something, they are increasingly using more of the chat than the typical search. So at least, again, this data is now kind of dated. This is at least like a year or so old, and I'm sure things have changed quite a bit as people get more used to doing like Copilot chat or Chat GPT and so on. But I'm going to switch to another application, which is auditing an LLM. So I mentioned early on that one of the challenges with LLM is it can hallucinate. Now, the problem with hallucination is a lot of the times we detect something like that after the fact. So it's not something that you kind of know before, but it's something that the LLM generates, and then if you verify it, and then that's where like you learn that, oh, this doesn't even exist, this is made up, and then so on. So what we wanted to do is, okay, well, we're not going to go exactly after detecting hallucination, but we want to analyze the LLM itself to see what is its propensity for hallucinating. And we didn't even call it hallucination. We said, what is its propensity for being inconsistent, essentially? And so we're auditing an LLM, and there are a number of ways to do the auditing. What we chose, what we call multi-probe auditing. So the simple idea is if you ask somebody the same question 5 different ways, and if you get a different answer, then I don't know if they're lying or not, but at least they're being inconsistent, right? This also speaks to bias. So if a man asks a question versus a woman asks a question, if a doctor asks a question versus a teacher asks a question, if the answer for factual things are different based on who's asking the question, that also speaks something perhaps about bias, but certainly about inconsistency. So what we do is, let me walk from the backward, like from the right side. So here's an LLM that we want to audit. And the way we want to audit is we want to ask it the same question 5 different ways, and then see what are those answers. And if these are like 5 different answers for the same factual question and variation of that question, then that's kind of a problem. But if these answers are pretty much the same, then at least there is a consistency. Again, we're not talking about truth. We're not talking about verifying that, but just like, is this consistent or not? So that's our objective. That's what we're trying to do. Now, the question is, where do these probes come from, right? So you have one question, how do you come up with 5 variations of it? Well, you can manually do it, but then that's not scalable. Or you can use another LLM to generate that. But then how would you tell if it did the right job and so on? So that's where we apply that process I was describing before. And here is a short version of it, where first 2 individuals separately determine what are the right criteria through which you would even say that these are the right prompts, right? Oh, sorry, probes. Let me be actually clear. These are the probes. So these are like 5 versions of the same question. So you first decide on those criteria, then you work on your prompt template. So given a question, given the instruction, this LLM comes up with different versions of the same question, right? And then you use those predetermined criteria to judge if it met the criteria and so on, and then kind of revise it and so on. So it's running through the same process, but now for different purpose. Yeah. In fact, we put this in practice, and we design a demo that you can access. And this is what it looks like. Maybe this is better to kind of understand what we're trying to do is, so for instance, here we say we want to audit llama. Sorry if this doesn't look very clear, but the step one, we choose which model we want to audit. Second, you put a question like, how long should you wait before eating a meal and going swimming? Right? So that's kind of a question. And then what happens here is another LLM that's not llama that comes up with these 5 versions of that question. And if you can read it, like, how soon after eating can I go swimming? Can I swim immediately after eating? Is it safe to swim right after a meal? You see, these are kind of variations of the same question. And then the idea is if you were to, and in this particular demo, we are picking like 2 out of these 5 questions to run, and then we get 2 answers. And then we are trying to see how similar are these 2 answers semantically, right? And so we get some score. But the point is, if you were to ask the same question 5 different ways, for which you expect there to be same or very similar answer, are you getting same or similar answer? And the more they vary, the less consistent this model is. So that may indicate bias or hallucination, but it's not guaranteed. So again, we're not directly addressing bias or hallucination, but we are saying, is there an indication? So the more inconsistent you are, the more you're likely to be biased or hallucinating. All right, so that's the auditing, part here.
Is that any different from saying that again, that reliability is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for validity?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So my question is, does this ever get beyond that?
Yeah. So not this particular application, but the idea is, so what we're trying to do with auditing is raising a flag where some expert or human would need to come in and then probe it further, right? So that's what it's trying to accomplish, because that will require some domain knowledge, that will require some expertise. And so the tool itself, the method itself doesn't offer that, but it kind of gets us to the point where, like, hey, there is a lot of inconsistent things happening here. And so now somebody needs to come in to check. So here's a kind of what it kind of looks like. So what you see here, this is testing on truthful QA. So there are 817 questions. And so it is for each of the questions, we generate 5 versions of it, right? So each data point here shows a version of that question. So, there are like 4,000 data points here. On the x-axis is the variation in those questions. And the y-axis is the variation in the answers, corresponding answers. So obviously there is more, the more variation than in the question, the more variation there would be in the answer. That's what we would typically expect, right? So you would kind of expect this to kind of be a diagonal line, from lower left to upper right. But some models will exhibit some behavior. So for instance, this is a good behavior here where I'm circling, for llama, where the variation is more densely matching up with the question and the response. If you go up here, this is kind of not so good, because it says that there is more variability in the answers than in the question. So as you change the variability in the questions, there's a lot more variability in the answers happening. So there's less consistency here. In Falcon, it's happening maybe more. So there's a quantitative way to also do this. I'm just showing you this kind of more qualitative here, right? So the more data points you have above this line, the worse it is. The more data point you have below this line, the better it is, because it means that even when you ask the question with more variety, you're getting less variety in the answer. So you're getting more consistent answer. Again, we're not saying anything about the truth of that answer. We're just saying, and again, maybe this is an interrogation technique. If you're trying to see if somebody's lying or not, you ask the same question multiple times and to see if they, and we often do this in surveys also, and other techniques where we repeat the same question in other, like, different ways to see if people are paying attention or not. People are being truthful or not or so not. But that doesn't mean that, we are actually detecting the truth. It's just an indication in that direction. Okay, so I'm gonna actually wrap up because I'm gonna be out of time and I wanna make sure that there's some time for questioning. So I'll quote this Reagan thing, trust but verify. So when it comes to using LLMs, sure, you can use LLM. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as saying don't. There are definitely cases where you shouldn't be using LLM. But if you're using it, but please verify, right? One of the things we learned through all of this work is human in the loop is very important. Whether you do that for verification of the criteria for judging LLM responses, you use it to generate or revise the prompts, you use it for doing other kinds of consistency checks, but it's very important to have that. But the way I kind of think about it, and people then critique, well, then what's the point of using LLM if you're putting so much human, because one big reason for using LLM is it saves you effort, it saves you time, you can do kind of applications that you couldn't do if you had to rely on humans all the time. Well, so I think about this as like setting up an assembly line, right? So if imagine you're creating this assembly line, so there's an initial cost to create that mold, to design that mold, to verify that, and making sure that everything is right. And that's where this human in the loop comes in, where, as I described, the qualitative coding thing, you are working with one another, you're working with the machine to set that up. So there's initial high cost, but then you have the setting up, and now it's very validated, it's verified. Now you can have the assembly line start running, at scale, right? And so now you start kind of benefiting from that initial cost. That being said, you don't just leave the assembly line running on its own forever. You still need some human in the loop to quality check, to see if things that you set up, this assembly line, if things that are coming off of it is still okay. But now you don't have to check everything that comes off, right? Because it's the same thing that, the same process apply, but you do some sampling of it for quality check. And as you do that, you realize if the assembly line is still running correctly as you expect, or you need to do some revision and so on. So that creates a sustainable process where you still have quality check, but you're able to achieve the scale, right? So this is what we kind of want to do, going from pilot to co-pilot to autopilot, where we can just, ideally, and at least I know many people would just want to hand it over to the LLMs or these tools, like you run the things and I don't have to. But as we want to do that, the scaling, because, a lot, like doing that autopilot essentially gives us that scaling, right? And that would be great. But as you want to do that left to right, you also need more trust and more verification. So handing over the control to an LLM or machine like that, you have to have that trust. Now, that trust has to come through verification. And that's the central argument for all of this thing. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't or you can't trust, but if you're doing that, there's a increasing burden on you as a researcher to ensure that verification and then achieved on this scale. So let me end it here and open for any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The questions are open from here locally and also remotely. As usual, I'm not at a loss, but I prefer not to be the one asking the questions. Go ahead. Say your name. I'm gonna point towards you. Say your name and.
Which one before? Which one?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Yasmin. Actually, I want to ask a question related to the use case of a large language model. We use it, as you mentioned, in several aspects. The two things that concerned me is about once we want to make content from the large language model, either if we use ChatGPT or other generated models, and other aspects of replacing the human annotation. We call it data labeling. So if we want to take the second one, data annotation, we use a human in the normal, without using large language model. Usually we use a human expert in the domain to annotate our data, especially if our data is related to social sciences or human sciences. So at the end, we use like Amazon Web Service that hire people to annotate our data. And at the end, it should be 100%, let's say, good to be published on the data repositories that machine learning scientists use these data to train, etc. For the case that we use the large language model for data annotation, with the process of human in the loop, we are coming back to use the human being in the process. So my question is, I think that we cannot depend on the large language model 100% in this process, especially if the data content is related to social sciences, human sciences, not just numbers. The annotation needs to read the whole text and to see the word dependencies if we talk about content generation. So what do you think on this aspect? Do you think from what I'm saying, I believe in the human in the loop, and I mentioned that in one of my conclusion once I have a small experience with that. I mentioned that human in the loop is very important for verification, as you conclude today. But in case that we are in this fast era, so do you believe that sometimes we are coming back to the human? This is the
Okay, the question is asked. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, you're asking if in some of the cases where you really need human touch, should we still use LLM or how to, is that correct, my interpretation? Because you're talking about some social science issues that.
I mean that once we created content that based on some theories exist in the literature of human sciences, and you want to see how the attitude or how large language model mimic this case, and you use a human in the loop in the verification process. But at the end, I think that we are coming back to the same. Let's say we are in a loop that we said we want to use large language model to help us in mimicking some context. So I think that it's good to have a human in the loop, but I think it's an extra step. Maybe someone will say, I want to use I don't want to use the LLM to do the content generation. I prefer to do manual labeling because it will be more accurate. For example, I will not put myself in comparison between what I found from the content generated by, for example, ChatGPT, and then I will be compact.
Cut off. It has to cut off. It's too long. Back to Chirag.
Yeah, I think so. I would caution. Again, this is a general purpose, not general, but this is kind of a generic, in a way, method, they describe here. What I'm not commenting on is the appropriateness of this method for given your application. So I would caution, this is, of course, not just because it produces verifiable outcome, that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. There are cases where things are a lot more sensitive than like my application here, right? Where we were just labeling or trying to understand user intent, search versus chat, and so on. So I think I would be cautious to just use this. So there are times when, yes, you would incur that cost of having humans and not use LLM because you don't want to trust LLM or you can't justify the use of it. Some of the applications where I've seen some of the areas where this is truly the case is sensitive applications in healthcare, in defense, in security, where it's not enough to just get this verification or this this agreement, but it's too sensitive to trust any involvement of LLM at all, or anything that you can't explain. LLM, even after all of these things, are still black boxes. So I think it needs to be, taken with that caution.
Move to Ana Maria Di Giulio.
Yes, hello. My name is Ana Maria Di Giulio. I'm a linguist. I also do computer science, and I'm really interested in models that mimic human language and the understanding. So when I look at LLM, I observe and results of LLM, I observe that they don't know much about meaning, right, of what they're asked. So because LLM are LLM, right? They're models that are pre-trained and it's based on strings or sequences of words and so on and so forth. So I really enjoyed your presentation because you point to the fact that in effect, yes, how can we approach hallucination and all sorts of problems related to LLM? You have to have as you propose, post factum repair strategies, so to speak, and you have humans to do that. So my question to you is that suppose that we're in the future somewhere, and would you envision a system that would incorporate from the basis the knowledge of what we have, as an artificial system asked for? So the knowledge of language and possibly some kind of knowledge of the world, right? And possibly a theory of intent and what it is, right? So I, again, feel that your work is very important because you are looking at a way to save LLMs, right, so to speak, and improve them by human intervention, which is strange in effect, as the previous question mentioned, because it's automatic, right? So try to, in a way, in the future, and working towards this, having model which know more about language to start with, right? So I wonder what you think about this.
Yeah, actually, it's a really good question. Thank you for your comments too. Actually, some of that is already happening. So one area that I would point to is LLM-based personas. And so a lot of work that is happening is giving LLM a certain persona. And with that persona comes this background knowledge, right? So assuming a role of a lawyer, right, with certain demographic, with certain kind of background and so on. And then having that play a role while you're doing whatever the actual task is, right? And so, for instance, one of my students is looking at brainstorming as an application. And in a brainstorming or a design session where you want to have different kind of stakeholders, different kind of people participate. Now, she is looking at different LLMs that assume different roles or persona and participating in that, right? Now, it remains to be seen how much, as you were reflecting on it, how much of that background knowledge of the culture, the language, and lived experiences can LLM really bring to the table? Now, many would argue that it's just impossible because when you talk about lived experiences, you're talking about living entities like humans. So LLM by definition cannot, but there are certainly people who are starting to do that approximation, and they're very enthusiastic about it. They're starting to like. So I think, I don't know. I'm a bit skeptic. And this kind of hopefully reflects in my talk today that yes, I see the potential, but if you're not careful, you could really create some real harm. Actually, people have been
Chirag, you have to leave in 8 minutes. So we have one more question here, and we also Virginia with a question. So ask the question.
Thank you for keeping track for me.
Let's ask your question now, and then we'll move to Virginia, and then it's over.
Well, thank you for the talk, the great talk, actually. My name is Dominic. You can see me here. My question is in regards of the auditing part. What was, maybe I missed that part, but what was the similarity matrix that you use to actually compare?
Yeah, so this is semantic similarity. So I think we use sentence BERT or some other, variation of it to see. And so the idea here, and it's very simple actually, that you can look at these 5 questions on the top right here, and the question like how semantically similar they are, right? So that will generate a score. And then you look at the answers that you, so the similarity score here you're seeing are the semantic similarity among the answers. So that's 84%. But as I say, you can do the same thing on the question side. So that gives you a way to plot something like this as a way to see a general behavior of a model. So this is a specific instance, like one question, 5 variations of it, 5 answers, and so on. But if you're auditing an LLM, you're not going to do just like one question at a time, or right. I mean, you need to have a whole set of questions. And so for our purpose, we use truthful QA data set for doing that auditing. I hope that answers the question.
Okay,
Thank you. Yeah.
okay, thank you. And now we have the last question from Virginia Valiant.
Thanks again. My question is similar to the last questioners. I wondered whether you tried different measures of semantic similarity or whether you just used the BERT measure, because different measures might give you different results.
Yeah, I wish I have the answer to that. I know we did try, but I don't remember now what. And my student who's the first author on this, she would probably know. But
yeah,
so I
it's
don't
not
have
in
a
your
good answer to
paper.
your
I
question.
looked at your paper online, and it's not in the paper. What else you might have tried? Thank you.
Base.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So, but semantic similarity, none of them are perfect. Perfect, but I don't remember what other things we tried. But it seemed like a reasonable thing, again, because we're not testing for the truth here. We are only checking for how similar the answers will be for similar questions. And so something reasonable, essentially. And as I was saying before, that what this does, it doesn't itself just say there's something like, so when you look at plot like this, can you tell if one model is better than the other or one model has problem? No, but as it looks at, are there more points on the above the line versus below the line, that may raise a flag. And that's where a human expert like annotator or somebody, can come in and start, doing the examination. And just to add one last thing, so this was actually inspired by some work we are doing for Gates Foundation. And Gates Foundation were interested in, they observed that a lot of the area that they have all this like different projects, mostly in Southeast Asia and some of those Asian countries where people are using these kind of LLMs in the field, like, farmers and teachers, and without understanding how good, bad those things are. And so they wanted some indication for the field workers, their actual volunteers who are there in the field, some way to look at these or like flag this or caution this. And so this kind of really came out of that. So ultimately, it is going to be the responsibility of people who are in the field, who understand the local culture and the languages, but this gives them kind of this, like, hey, raising a flag that, and we actually ran the question that the farmers were asking. So, we started with that and we found the inconsistencies, and that was raising a flag. But again, sitting here, I have no idea if those farmers, like, is this a good or right or bad or not? So, but we raised a flag that be careful using this particular version of this model because it's shown to have a lot of inconsistency. Please verify, please check. So then they can use the domain knowledge in the field that they have to do something about it. So that's the full application pipeline.
Yeah, my question is maybe one step back. So I'm just guessing, I don't know, that there's a lot of overlap of content words when you've got high similarity. But, and this gets back to Dr. DiSciullo's comments earlier, we know that you can have two sentences that mean the same thing. They might not have any overlap with respect to content words. But I'm guessing that what BERT does is heavily rely on overlap of content words to judge similarity. And so that may or may not be a good way of determining whether, so for your purposes, I see where you would particularly caution use, but in terms of knowing, are these actually similar or dissimilar? If you're only going on content words, you might not be doing the best thing.
Yeah, so it is more than content words. So it's not just looking at the textual or syntactic similarity, it's actually looking at semantic similarity. To the extent you can believe that something like BERT captures semantics, right? And so it is looking at embedding representation of these things and not simply looking at, so this is not that 84% accuracy, sorry, the similarity is not simply the overlap of the words, but it's the overlap, the meaning of that. So it is actually taking each of those answers, putting it in the embedding space, and then, you know, comparing the similarity in those vectors. So that's, yeah. I mean, it's not perfect for sure, but it's definitely more sophisticated than the word overlap.
Okay.
Sorry to have to interrupt, but you have another talk to give now, and it's 45. So I want to thank you for coming here and for presenting this. It was the hope that it would eventually get to truth, but I suppose you're not going to get to truth.
No, not today.
Not today, not today.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you for coming to Montreal virtually. Thanks for everybody.
Truth is hard. Truth is expensive. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's very nice to meet you all.